Hi everyone, I'm Lisa Savage. I'm a candidate for the U.S. Senate running against Susan Collins under ranked choice voting. And welcome to our webinar series, The Way Forward. This is the second webinar in a series, and we're very, very pleased to have some great presenters to share their thoughts with you today on the topic of racial justice at home and abroad. We're going to be hearing from Desiree Vargas first, Ajamu Baraka next, and Joseph Jackson. And there will be time for audience Q&A, so you can use the function on the Zoom window that you're looking at, the Q&A, to submit questions, and we'll be addressing those toward the end of the webinar. Please join me in welcoming, first of all, Desiree Vargas. Desiree works with the Racial Equity and Justice Advocates for Black and Brown Communities. Our campaign became familiar with Desiree and her great work because we did some decolonizing the workplace training with Desiree and her partner a while back. And she also works at the Peace and Justice Center of Eastern Maine in Bangor. She identifies as, I'm probably going to say this wrong and she can correct me, Hikwa Yagwa Taino of the Caribbean, and is also a student, a community organizer, and an activist. She's going to talk to us today about intersectionality, and I know that we're all going to learn a lot. So please join me in welcoming Desiree.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Lisa, for that introduction. Yeah, so I do wear different hats in the community, and I am always glad to be welcome to speak from an Indigenous woman of color perspective. It's really important to be able to center a voice like mine, and so this is really an honor. So I guess I just wanted to start out, you know, I really like that quote picked out. There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. And I really like this quote because, you know, it's really hard to be able to address an issue just from one single point of view. It has to be, you know, from an intersectional perspective. We have to be able to center the voices of diverse voices at the table. To me, you know, having diverse voices heard, to me is like, it's like an importance of a garden, having a diversity of different flowers and vegetables and herbs and different plants. It's more creative, less boring, and it's important to be able to be inclusive. And so, I guess, you know, some of the issues that I really wanted to speak about, you know, is about Black, Brown, and Indigenous women of color in particular. We've had every opportunity to give up since colonialism expansion, capitalism expansion, and with those expansions came the oppression of femicide and other patriarchal oppressions. And, you know, after 500 years of oppression and attack, it's really cut off, it's like cutting off the wings of a bird, but those birds are still able to teach their young how to fly. And that survival, that resistance, that healing, that power is in our DNA. And, you know, that's why when we talk about climate change, we can't just come at it as a perspective of, you know, an economic issue, how it takes toll on our economics, or we can't just come in as an environmental issue. It has to come as a holistic issue because, you know, things like climate change, one of the most pressing issues of our time, is a racial issue. It's a health issue. It's a gender issue, especially a gender and race issue because the people who are most vulnerable to climate change are women and people of color. And the people who are most vulnerable to oppressive systems like patriarchal systems, colonial system, neocolonial systems, capitalism are Black, brown, Indigenous people of color, especially women. And so when we talk about things like, you know, climate change, we have to talk about what comes with that. And definitely it was exacerbated with colonialism, and it goes hand in hand with femicide. And a lot of people may not be able to see that, but you know, we see women are, Indigenous women are, you know, there's you know, 5,712 Indigenous women were missing in 2016 alone. And then people just lost track. People lost track. And here in Maine, you know, to be able to address cases of violence against women, that was fought a long and hard fought battle for a really long time, and just really changed. And now there's an ability, at least in Maine, to be able to prosecute perpetrators of that violence. And so a lot of this violence goes hand in hand, especially with, you know, the genocide that happens with women, right? That's cutting off part of Indigenous people, including people who aren't Indigenous people who aren't federally recognized. That includes Indigenous people from diasporas as well, and descendants of Indigenous people. Having that violence against women creates a stop and genocide to culture and passing down culture, and that survival and those traditional knowledge is cut off and it's not passed down. So it's really important when we talk about, you know, something like climate change. We're talking about cultural genocide. We're talking about tradition, cut off to traditional ways of life. Even Black women are 5 times more likely to die during pregnancy and childbirth compared to white women. And Black and Indigenous children, Latinx children, are hardly focused on in the news when it comes to human trafficking or kidnapping. It's a lot of that focus is on white children. And so when we don't have that representation, and we don't have the data collection and the focus, we are at a disadvantage. And to be able to address some of these issues, these social issues, we need to have discussions of race. We need to have discussions of gender. We need to be centering the most marginalized of these voices in order not only for people from marginalized and unrepresented communities for their issues to be heard, but it impacts and improves everybody's lives. And so that was kind of what I wanted to talk about today. You know, for me, I really wanted to touch on climate change because it is such an important issue. And to me, it is one of those issues that a lot of people don't see as intersecting with feminism or intersecting with Indigenous sovereignty or Black liberation. And it's so important. You know, we see Indigenous people take care of 80% of the world's biodiversity. And so, like I said, when you have things like missing and murdered Indigenous crisis and going on, and the vast amount of Black women and Black girls, you know, incarcerated or trafficked or missing, that's, to me, that's, you know, that's cutting off our ability to survive, to pass down those survival mechanisms to our children and future generations, to pass down not only our cultural knowledge, but also just our survival as a community, as humans. And, you know, our ability to be able to be stewards of the land. If we have Indigenous people, you know, Indigenous women being attacked and facing this violence, who becomes the stewards of the land? We, as an Indigenous person, you know, and with that stat of Indigenous people taking care of 80% of biodiversity, an attack on Indigenous peoples is an attack on the land. It's an attack on Earth. It's an attack on our ability to be stewards of the land and take care of the Earth and continue to be able to do those things that our ancestors were able to do, living in reciprocity with Earth. And so, you know, landowners are mostly white people across the nation. And Maine is 95.5% white people, and most of those people own the land. So when we have an attack on just the small percentage of Black, Brown, Indigenous women of color, that percentage goes down. And so, you know, our stewardship to the land goes down, representation goes down. And so to me, it's all intersecting, it's all connected. I know we'll have somebody else speak more about incarceration rates and how that impacts communities, and that's really important too. And you know, I just encourage everyone to start taking up these issues, to be more aware. There's different things that allies can do, and the first step is becoming an ally. The second step is becoming an accomplice, and then the third step is becoming a co-resistor, a co-partner in these efforts. You know, one is kind of just, you know, looking into the awareness, looking at your own biases, doing your own education. An accomplice is kind of, you know, working within the system to make it better. And then another part is, you know, we don't always have to work within these systems of the kind of continuation of colonialism. We can work within our own communities. So to me, it's just as important. What's just as important as voting is being on the ground in your community, doing this work, working with your neighbors, doing the hands-on work to feed people, shelter people, help people have more access to surviving and thriving and living in reciprocity with each other and Earth, localizing how we redistribute these resources and how we can work together. To me, that's just as important. So yeah, I don't want to take up too much time, but I'll just pass the mic, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Desiree. You connected a lot of dots for us, and I love to, you know, notice the Indigenous wisdom. Really, any Indigenous people that I've ever learned about their culture, they say everything's connected. You can't separate life, if you have parts of life. It all affects the whole when we make a change. So thank you for helping us understand that and kind of contextualizing. We're going to hear next from Ajamu Baraka. He's going to connect some dots for us that many people don't think to connect, but I think this will be a good learning experience for many of us. Ajamu is a national organizer for the Black Alliance for Peace, and he was the 2016 candidate for vice president on the Green Party ticket with Jill Stein. And I am very pleased that he agreed to come on and talk to us about his work. He serves on the executive committee of the U.S. Peace Council and leadership body of the United National Anti-War Coalition. Most of us know that by its acronym UNAC. Ajamu is also an editor and contributing columnist for the Black Agenda Report, which is a great publication I read regularly, and a contributing columnist for Counterpunch. He was recently awarded the U.S. Peace Memorial 2019 Peace Prize and the Serena Sherm Award for Uncompromised Integrity in Journalism. So welcome, Ajamu.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lisa, and thank everyone who are participating in this very important conversation. And thank you, Desiree, for making those connections. And I'm going to continue along the same line in terms of making the connections, providing sort of a theoretical framework before we get to the issue of AFRICOM. Our master slide person, let me just first talk about a framework of understanding that I want to bring to the table before we start making the connections with the international component. You know, we talk about race, and this is a very important conversation. But what I want to talk about is an understanding we have to have in terms of what we mean by race, and connect that to our understanding in the Black Alliance for Peace. We are concerned with race, but we are more concerned with what we refer to as the ideology of white supremacy. We see a sort of a difference. Many people will concentrate on the issue of race, the term of race, but often they will suspend that to a sort of a psychological analysis, if you will, a critique of people's attitudes and values, which of course are important. But what we are more concerned with are the structural elements of white supremacy, the connecting of the ideas with the structures that deal with the issue, the question, the reality of power. And we say that that is the target of our political activity, to dislodge, to dismantle white supremacist power. And we think that's important, my friends, because as Desiree touched on, you know, when we contextualize what we are today and this moment of history, we can't do that until we ground it in an understanding of history and a framework of understanding. And for us, we have to start at the very beginning, that this country, this space that we refer to as the United States of America, we see as a settler colony, and that the U.S. state is a continuation of the U.S. Colonial state. And that this is more than just rhetoric, it is a reality. We say that basically when you look at the evolution of this country and the justifications for its very existence is grounded in notions of white supremacy. The notion of natural law being connected to the natural dominance of white people who came from Europe and invaded this land and invaded all of the Americas. And the way in which that was rationalized was that, you know, they were the humans, if you will, the real humans, and the humanity of the people who occupied these territories were not only in question, but often rejected. So, you know, what we see here is that this attitude is foundational to the existence of this country, and indeed to how many in this country see themselves and see the world. It is a foundational understanding, a foundational perspective that justified not only the conquest of the territory we refer to today as the United States, but also slavery. It was the justification for after the Civil War, where there was then national reconciliation. What happened was that the 10-year attempt to try to bring about some kind of democracy in this country, after theoretically African people were freed from slavery or fought for their own freedom from slavery, that reconciliation came at the cost of African people. That in essence, we were recolonized and then very often re-enslaved after 1877 with the imposition of the U.S. apartheid system. As the U.S. was enslaving us, it was still embarked on a brutal expansion across the Western territory in this march toward the Pacific Ocean to connect up the East Coast with the West Coast. So this violent expansion and this justification for white supremacy provided the material foundation for what we refer to as white power. Now, this is important, my friends, because when we take a look at U.S. foreign policies and we look at and try to understand what is happening today with the coronavirus and with the activities of the Trump administration in invading Portland by federal authorities, we find a convergence of all these various components. We want to very briefly demonstrate what I'm referring to. When we take a look at U.S. foreign policy, for example, we see that the justification for U.S. expansion and for global domination is still based on this very notion of the naturalness of white rule and white power. And we see the way in which this natural sort of position is reinforced by real structures of power. One of the major structures of power that we see and that we are concentrated on from the Black Alliance for Peace is the global command structures by the U.S. Government and the U.S. military. We say that you can't understand racism and you can't understand the violence of the police in the U.S. without connecting that to the overall mission and activity of the U.S. state. And that activity, as we have established, is one in which the foundation or the core of this activity is violence and the justification of violence against people of color. So the activities of the police to control and to contain Black and brown people in the U.S. is connected to the activity of the U.S. military abroad to control and to contain people of color in order to exploit them. So one of the ways in which they do this is their command structures. They have basically taken the world and divided up the world into various command structures. One of the ones that we are focused in on in the Black Alliance for Peace is the U.S. Africa Command, or AFRICOM. This is the command structure in which the U.S. has established a presence, a physical presence on the African continent. And so part of what we are attempting to do is to organize a campaign to make that link between the resistance against police brutality and violence in the U.S. And the militarism and violence by the U.S. abroad. So we say we must shut down AFRICOM. We must shut down all of the U.S. bases, all 800 to 1,000 across the planet, along with the NATO bases. And we say in Africa, that means to shut down the U.S. Africa Command. So that for us is a major component of our activity. AFRICOM was established in October 1st, 2008, right before Barack Obama assumed office. And we're soon coming up on an anniversary. So we say shut down AFRICOM has to be one of the demands. Next slide, please. So we understand that AFRICOM is justified by the U.S. authorities as a command structure whose concern is to fight against so-called terrorism. But what we say is that AFRICOM is a structure for the recolonization of the African continent. Next slide, please. So that recolonization is taking the form of these military to military agreements with 53 out of the 54 African nations. Oftentimes these agreements are with nations of dubious quality in terms of their relationship to their own people. being very repressive government. And we see that part of this process includes an expanding process of establishing bases on the African continent. Next slide. It's important for people to understand that as the U.S. has been expanding on the African continent to the tune of almost a 2,000% expansion over the last 10 years, simultaneous to that expansion on the African continent, they have been expanding the militarization of police forces domestically. That there was a 2,400% expansion of the Department of Defense 1033 program, the program primarily responsible for militarizing the police forces, just during the period of the Obama years. So these are the connections we have to make. Next slide, please. And so we see that when we have these massive expenditures for militarism, both the military budget and specifically for AFRICOM, that these resources are being diverted from the people and the objective human rights and human rights needs of the people to the pockets of the military. So my friends, in closing, because we only have a few minutes and I'm trying to cover a lot of material, we say that all of these issues have to be connected, that the issue of race and racism, white supremacy, has to be connected to the issues of the structures of white supremacy. And that if one understands that white supremacy and capitalism are connected, that basically, and the state, that all of these elements are interconnected. The state, its laws, the police, the courts, the prisons, because all are interconnected, you cannot get rid of one element without all of those elements. So we say that the way we deal with white supremacy is to deal with the structural expansion of it, the structural expressions of white supremacy. And so that is part of what we have to do, my friends, is part of the efforts that we must engage in to build a new world. The objective is basically to change the system, this government, this economic system, to engage in deep systemic change that moves collective humanity from a society and system that promotes greed, exploitation, and oppression to one that centers human needs, an economy that puts people, the planet, and peace over profits. And that, my friends, is our historic task and our responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajamu, for connecting a lot of those dots for us. This is my favorite slide of yours because I've just been a school teacher for 25 years and very underfunded schools. And I really like to make those equivalencies between what we're not spending money on that we could be spending money on. I think that this discussion about the structures by which white supremacy is brought to bear on people of color is a perfect segue to our next presenter. Joseph Jackson is going to share his work as the director of the Maine Prisoner Advocacy Coalition. And this is a group that engages in direct action and advocacy with the Maine Department of Corrections on behalf of prisoners and their families. He's also the advocacy director with Maine Inside Out, which builds community and develops youth leadership, initiating dialogue through the use of collaborative original theater, working across boundaries both inside and outside of Long Creek Youth Development Center. I've had the pleasure of seeing Inside Out Theater perform at an education conference I went to. And if you're in Maine and you get a chance to see these folks, it's a really amazing experience. Simultaneously, Joseph's been working with the Re-Entry Center in Belfast, working with incarcerated citizens, and this work led to the co-founding of the Restorative Artworks in Belfast, RAW, great acronym, creates original theater as therapy to address the post-traumatic stress of incarceration. So thank you, Joseph, for taking time to be with us today.
Oh, thank you, Lisa, for inviting me. And thank you, Ajamu and Desiree, for your wonderful presentations. I think that when we start talking about racial justice and how it looks in Maine, and especially the structural component that supports and maintains white supremacy, I think one has to look no further than our prison system and our criminal justice system here in Maine. And I think Desiree touched on it a little bit when talking about the disproportionate number of Black and brown bodies that are being swept up by that system. But not only is that system disproportionately impacting those communities, I think I would also add that they're disproportionately impacting communities that are inherently poor. And so I think that that is a component of this system. It is a system that is flawed. It is actually, I don't understand how a system, and when we talk about why are we here, when 7 out of 10 prisoners who are released return within 5 years. And it is a system that is not broken. It is meant to operate that way. It is meant to operate in a way where we see those failures, because I view this as a failure, especially when the Department of Corrections outlines itself and defines itself as a system that is designed to protect the public, as a system that is designed to teach and rehabilitation is one of its functions, it claims. And if these are its claims, then I will point to these kind of numbers where we see that it has utterly failed. It has failed to protect the public, and it has failed in its role of rehabilitation. I think the second part is that the school to prison pipeline is real. We are not just sweeping in bad adults. We are targeting, young kids. And in fact, until this year, Maine had no minimum age for which a kid could be incarcerated. And so there is a direct tie between who's getting suspended in our state and who is going to jail in our state. So we see that in a town in like Lewis in Maine, for instance, where the suspension rate is really high. And as Desiree pointed out, in Maine's population, especially for Black and brown people in Maine, our demographics are low. So 95% white, and with Black and brown people representing less than 1%. But yet when we're looking at who are the people that are young people that are being suspended, that number is roughly around almost half in Lewiston. And then we see that those numbers are then also begin to be perpetuated and who is entering that system. And so those numbers are as high as 30% and 28%, according to Muskie, that the juveniles housed in our youth development system are youth of color. The reason why I hop on this and why it's significant is because even with our youth system, the recidivism rate for youth is 44% within 1 year and climbs afterwards. And so we have a system where we're holding young people from the time that they're as young as 11 to their 21, and they have not been prepared to re-enter society. And the last point I would say is 94% of prisoners will be released. And when we're talking about release, we have to remember that almost everyone who enters that system is utterly destroyed. It doesn't matter if you're white, Black, blue, green, whatever color. Socially, you're destroyed. That means you can't maintain your housing. You don't maintain any form of employment. There is no transportation or no savings. We're just all drained up by that system. And so when you get out, it's like you're effectively starting over. And there is no mechanism in place. You let a guy out today from Maine, and I just picked up a young man today, and what he gets is $50 in his pocket. And this guy don't have a place to go. So how do you even know where to begin to start? If he had got a job today, he has to wait 2 weeks before his first paycheck. So he has to live off of $50 for 2 weeks. And so we have created a system that is built on, and I want to call it retribution and harm. And I think that we have to push back against this old notion. And I'm glad somebody brought up slavery, because the prison system and the way that we see prison today rose up out of that medium. And so seeing that the 13th Amendment says that slavery has been abolished, except in all cases, except for when one has committed a felony, what we're essentially doing is creating more victims and in fact, using their labor and because you need prison labor in order for a prison to run for free. We create more victims because that the folks that are entering our system house families. And so by extension now, their families have been impacted socioeconomically. And can we go to the next slide? Because I'm seeing it go by, but, and I can go by, I talk pretty fast, so I'm sorry. But 20,000 kids in Maine have been impacted by having an incarcerated parent. And I think that when we start talking about incarcerated parents, there is a generational component to that. So I do work with young people that have been in the system. And when I see them exit the system, the sanctions that they face are lifetime long. They last their entire lifetime. One, because they have been labeled a felon, and in many cases, that record is not as accessible to anyone. They have a hard time getting housing, a hard time finding employment and maintaining employment. And so the resources needed to just repair the harm from being incarcerated is just not there. And we need to begin to start thinking about what we want to do in a society, especially one like Maine, where as many as high as 20% of our population have been impacted by our criminal justice system. And so, you know, criminal justice system in Maine is a racial justice issue. I think that when we look at the people in power and these structures that maintain these systems, especially with all the decision makers, there is no decision maker in the Department of Corrections or in any department in Maine that is a person of color. When we look around our school systems and universities, there is no dean or that is, you know what I mean, or head of our colleges that are people of color. When we look at the structures of economics and who has money, we don't see people of color, but yet we see people of color and all the negative consequences, who are the highest number of poverty, who have the most frequent contact with police in our state. And so I think that criminal justice reform is racial justice reform. And I really would like for us to do a lot more when we're focusing on that and in this notion of retribution and punitive philosophy, and return to a place where if it's going to be a system that we have at all, that is designed to heal people and erase harms. And I'll end there, Lisa. I'm good.
Thank you, Joseph, for your presentation. I know the first time that we met, I got a sticker that said "No kids in prison." I put it right on my new laptop, so I see it every day. And maybe the first question I'd like to ask is, could you tell us a little bit about Long Creek and what role that plays in the school to prison pipeline, and why there are children as young as 11 there? And what do you see as the alternative to kids in prison? I agree with you. No kids should be in prison, but what are we going to do to help kids that are struggling and need some
that is really an excellent question. And so I have a few answers, but I think one is that when we have to look at mistakes that young people make as simply mistakes. And let's understand that I know there are some people out there that feel like that there are some kids that are kind of dangerous. And so that number in Maine will be 4. And so we would have a facility that is, you know, brings in $18 million, or it costs $18 million a year for 4 kids. So I sat on the Juvenile Justice Task Force, and one of the things we saw is that many of the kids there are there because they simply don't have a place to go. We don't have housing for those kids. we have young girls who are incarcerated for being victims of sex crimes. So our response to them being victims is to incarcerate them for their protection. And I think that the harm and trauma that's caused to young people by this system makes them worse, not better. One, the social development years for being able to develop socially is in the community. And so when you separate them from the community and put them in this bubble, what you are essentially doing is interrupt all of that. And now you're criminalizing them. You have criminalized them to say that you need to be in a box and you need to be controlled. And I think that when we look at, and we've been brainwashed to think that kids should, that is what is needed for kids. When I talk about the school to prison pipeline, I believe that's real, because I think that in many cases, we identify the kid that is in need when they're in school. That's why 100% of them have been suspended. And in certain neighborhoods, addiction is treated with counseling and substance abuse, but in other neighborhoods, addiction is treated with incarceration. And so we really have to look at the harm that the kid is at. It's really individualized, so there's not one answer gonna fit all kids. But I think that once we begin to see that a kid has some issues, really start putting resources to find out what that issue is, and then put the resource into resolving that issue. And then there will be no need for an institution like Long Creek. We could divert those funds and use them elsewhere.
Great, thank you. Our first question from the audience was directed to you, Joseph, but I'm going to actually open it up, and I would love to hear what Ajamu and Desiree have to say about this too. This month, the Lewiston School Committee is considering the role of school resource officers. That means, you know, armed police in schools. There are currently 4 in Lewiston. I happen to know that recently the Portland, Maine's biggest city, voted to remove they had 2 school resource officers, and the school board went till midnight and voted to remove those. Do you have thoughts about the specific role of police in schools and what policy changes would make sense? Maybe I'll throw this out to Desiree and Ajamu first, and then we could circle back around to you, Joseph. Police in schools, why are they there, and what role does this play in the overall picture? Thank you, Ajamu.
Well, I think the role they play is creating the militarized consciousness, conditioning young people as part of the school to prison pipeline process, conditioning young people to partial incarceration, if you will, where they basically are controlled. They see the armed might of the state represented by this individual with a gun on his or her side. Situations that used to arrive in schools that will be dealt with internally by the school. Now you bring in the state, kids get arrested for being in fights. So it is part of an overall repressive environment that has developed in the U.S. It is part of a process of retribution, a culture of retribution and violence, and being directed at populations that are deemed not to be as worthy as other populations. So I say all police out of the schools and use those resources for other means.
Thanks, Ajamu. Desiree, would you like to weigh in on this question?
Yeah, so I definitely have to agree. It is a social conditioning, you know, phenomena going on, and I would say, you know, it is kind of that process of almost like preparing our youth, our future generation, to be conditioned to the fact that you know, that tough on crime concept that happened, I know, not in my generation, but before my generation, and some other administrations, of that let's get tough on crime mentality, this war against this violence going on, when we see that most statistics show that most individuals that are incarcerated, it's not for violent crimes. So now you have these future gens, you know, instead of having that support, that rehabilitation, it's being socialized into their consciousness to think that, you know, if you do something wrong, there's going to be this almost irreparable socially, you know, punishment that can impact them emotionally, mentally, physically, spiritually, or socially, you know, going forward. And now that's, you know, that concept is put into them. And then when they go out, they graduate, go to college, go into the workforce, that mentality is still there. And people may think that, you know, that's to help them become more productive citizens for this capitalist, you know, society, but it's actually causing trauma. It's causing, you know, it will, you know, stats have showed that it causes students to react out, or if they're not even acting out, it's just part of that process of just being able to do what you want because you have the power to do so, and picking and choosing who you can do that to disproportionately.
Thanks, Desiree.
Joseph, would you like to comment on police?
I want to thank Desiree and Ajamu for that, but one of the things I think that is different communities have different relationships with the police. And so, for instance, in our wealthier neighborhoods, I mean, kids have a very friendly, you know, relationship with police. In a city like Lewiston, where our student body makes up nearly 30% of youth of color, and then we look at our administration, and that was just less than 1% of teachers of color, then you're bound to have some issues of cultural differences that come up. And I think what we get lost in is that every time that some disruption happens, when we want to call the police, that there are other means, other things that can happen. For instance, Lewiston once had a restorative practice officer. That position was grant funded, and so that's part of this discussion. And you know what the restorative practice officer does is supposed to be there to bridge those cultural differences, instead of relying on your SRO, who becomes the the mechanism for all things, right? Whether it's mental health issue, whether it's a fight, whether somebody is smoking some weed in the corner. And so all of these issues being under the police banner really criminalizes youth. And once the youth is criminalized in school, then the whole school sees them as criminal. And I just want to add another part, is that when this happens, it doesn't just impact that youth, it really harms our community when we are using this force, this armed militia, as the way of control and power over our youth, and especially our Black youth. And we need to figure out a way to reverse this and begin to put some of those resources that we really want to throw into more safety and security and police back into the community, so the community can use these resources to address those issues that for these youth. And so that's how I would answer it. But I definitely think that Lewiston should really think about, reinvesting their money. And obviously one of those SROs was retiring anyway, and reinvesting in a restorative practice officer is definitely the way we should be advocating and moving away from just solely relying on our police.
Thanks, Joseph. Yeah, I would really urge people on this webinar to write to the Lewiston School Board. I did that last week. I received an answer from one of the school board directors saying thank you for the input. One of the things that I heard some Black students talking before the Portland School Board meeting where they were sort of practicing on a Zoom webinar. They were going to testify. And several of them made the point that teachers will use the presence of a school resource officer to threaten unruly students. So it's kind of like that, you know, wait till your dad gets home type of thing, but they're basically threatening them with someone who's carrying a weapon, could arrest them, and put them in prison, and that teachers, instead of dealing with the disciplinary issues that come up in any high school, the teachers are using the school resource officer that way. I liked what you said about different communities having different relations with the police. One of the things I often hear in Central Maine, where I live, is, oh, there's no such thing as white privilege. And there's a lot of poverty, a lot of white poverty in Central Maine. And people will be like, we didn't grow up privileged, you know, because they grew up very low income. And the analogy that I've found that's the easiest to explain to at least adults what white privilege is I say, did your teenage kid ever do something dumb that brought them into contact with the police? And almost any adult's gonna go, yeah. And I say, were you afraid that they would die as a result of that contact with the police? And most white people are gonna go, no. You know, that in essence is the difference between having white privilege or not having white privilege. I don't know if you guys have ever seen that Twitter hashtag criming while white. It was popular a couple years back. White people went on and said all the things that they had gotten away with, and they had come in contact with the police, but the police had been like, oh, that's, you know, that's okay. Anyway, thank you all for your thoughts on police in schools. I hope a year from now, we will see no police in schools in Maine. That would be great. We have got a question here, probably mostly for Desiree, but could be for any of you. And that question is, what are some direct actions that can be taken that will address issues where environmental justice and racial justice intersect in Maine?
Yeah, so first and foremost, we have to go beyond the land acknowledgement. This is Wabanaki land. And we have to go beyond that by just acknowledging that there has to be more land back actions. Like I said, you know, even though the federal domestic violence bill passed and helped tribes to be able to prosecute, it left Maine tribes behind, and for tribes to be able to prosecute. And because of the 1980 land claim settlement, that really, that causes restrictions for tribes to be able to not only protect women who are stewards of this earth, and also keepers of traditional ecological knowledge, and keepers of families and our future generations who are going to take care of the earth as well. You know, we have to really think. We have to first take care of women. Our first home was the womb. Our second home is earth. So to be able to do both of these things includes centering the voices of Indigenous people, and being able to also center the voices of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people of color who are more vulnerable to climate change impact. That also includes, for Maine, you know, localizing our businesses, our economy, our food sovereignty, and the more we localize, the better. But it's so hard for Black, Brown, Indigenous people of color to have businesses here, to stay here, to be able to stay here as educators, as social workers, because of the lack of jobs, because of the lack of culture and community here. People come and then they end up leaving. And if they stay, they are facing all these disproportionate issues that we've talked about, and that includes not having the support when there is racial issues, and so being able to have support for and investing in Black, Brown, Indigenous communities of color, centering voices in climate justice initiatives, centering water rights, land sovereignty, Black liberation, reparations, in the criminal justice reform, all that is what ties essentially to environmental justice as well. And being able to look at switching our verbiage, you know, we're not climate change activists, we're water and land defenders, we're water and land protectors, you know, being able to switch our language to be less corporate and capitalistic, and really realizing, you know, decolonizing our minds and our hearts and our thoughts. Indigenous people see the land and our plants and animals as relatives. And so being able to really see that interconnectedness, you know, taking care of our relatives.
Thanks, Desiree. This is a question for Ajamu. Why do you think that AFRICOM expanded so much under the first Black president of the U.S.? Was that coincidence, or are those two things related? And then also, this is a related question, why do you think people in the U.S. know so little about AFRICOM?
Well, very, very good questions. I think it was more than just a coincidence. AFRICOM was officially launched October 1st, 2008. And Barack Obama assumed office in January of 2009. We do believe that decision makers in the U.S. foreign policy community saw an opportunity under this first Black president to expand the military presence on the African continent. They understood he would give that process political cover. And that's exactly what they did. The justification was around the issue of expanding so-called terrorism, but that didn't really take off that well. It didn't really become a real issue on the African continent until Barack Obama and the U.S. and NATO attacked and destroyed Libya. By attacking Africa and destroying the most prosperous nation on the African continent. It not only destabilized the continent, but there was a significant dissemination, if you will, distribution of military arms from the Libyan state. They ended up in the hands of various non-state actors across the African continent. So the destabilization of Libya, or the destruction of Libya, helped to destabilize a number of other African states, creating the conditions in which these African leaders made requests for assistance from the U.S. So they created the conditions that allow for them to, in fact, realize a self-fulfilling prophecy. So this is part of what a U.S. president does. That president is there to advance the interests of the ruling elite. It doesn't really matter the gender or the race of that individual. They're there to advance those objective interests. And Barack Obama did that very well.
And the second part of my question was, why do people in the U.S. know so little about AFRICOM, if they know anything at all? I've been paying about 30% of my income as a teacher for these, decades, basically funding the recolonization of Africa. And I know about it, but I think a lot of my neighbors do not. Why is that?
I think that it's connected to the fact that so many people in the U.S. are so U.S.-centric, if you will. That is, the gaze, the framework of understanding the world tends to stop at the borders of the U.S. They know very little about what the U.S. state is involved in their name globally. Most people would be shocked if they knew the level of criminality that the U.S. state is engaged in. And that is done on purpose, even under the Democrats. The Democrats are just as inclined to support U.S. criminality abroad as the Republicans, but yet they are framed by some people as the peaceniks, the doves, which is a complete distortion of the role of the Democratic Party. So this luxury, if you will, of not knowing what your government is doing, not taking any responsibility for its activity, is another manifestation of privilege. Privilege that not only is experienced by white folks, but also everybody who resides in the U.S. Because even poor people have a certain degree of privilege being at the center of empire. Poverty in places like where I sit right now in Latin America, is very different than the poverty we see in North America. It's just as grinding in terms of its impact on the spirit. In fact, I would argue that it's tougher to be poor in the U.S. Than any other place in the world, psychologically and spiritually. But, part of what we're trying to do, the Black and Master Peace, and I think it's our responsibility as a people conscious, is to make the connections between what is happening in the U.S. with the world. Help people to understand that we are part of a global humanity, a collective humanity, and that you can't understand your reality in the U.S. without understanding the world. And when you understand the world, you understand your political and your moral responsibilities. That's part of what we're trying to do. That's why we're bringing people information on AFRICOM, bringing people information on what's happening in places like Yemen, Palestine, so that they can make those proper connections.
Thank you, Ajamu. That's very helpful. This is probably a question for Joseph. What can be done to stop criminalizing victims of sex crimes? I think many of us were shocked to hear that the victims of sex crimes are incarcerated. Can you give us some suggestions about what we can do to help?
Wow, thank you. It's a good question. I think one is recognizing that that the victims of sex crimes are in fact victims first. I think that we have to begin to recognize that. And then second, I think that we have to provide resources. I think many of the women that find themselves in this position and are trafficked in such a way, they don't have the resources to get out, right, of their situation. And so, I mean, a lot of this, when we can continue to go back, is about the lack of resources and lack of places where we can respond to these conditions of harm that is happening in our community. And the only mechanism right now to respond to that harm is law enforcement. And I think that we really have to create more different structures to be able to, respond to these type of situations. I think that sex trafficking is just one of those issues. I akin it to the same as someone who's suffering from addiction, suffering from substance use disorder, which we have now identified as someone that as a mental illness, right? That if somebody has a condition that they really can't help themselves, and we have criminalized this, healthcare issue. So really, we really need to think about creating structures that are going to be addressing this in a different way. And I think that it will have a tremendous impact on the way that we look at and do corrections when we begin to identify people as people who need help and instead of punishment.
Thanks, Joseph. I think that this is part of this whole movement to defund police, is to redirect those funds into the kind of community programs that you're talking about, providing services that are needed. And it's quite true that we've turned the police into the response mechanism for everything. Cat in a tree, call the police. Someone's having a psychotic break, call the police.
And I just wanted to add, there are nonprofits and people out here in the communities doing this work. and they're doing this work on pennies, you know what I mean, for, you know what I mean, pennies. And so we already have the answers. People are out here trying to do that work. All we have to do is fund them.
Thanks. This is a question probably for Ajamu, but maybe for some others. I don't know what everyone's party politics are because that's not the topic of our conversation today, but this question got a lot of upvotes, and it says, what should I do as an artist to connect with more African Americans in my community about voting green?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think one thing that has to happen is you have to try to establish some kind of relationship to the African American communities, which means linking up with organizations that are doing work in that community. That's one thing. The other thing, though, that will be helpful is taking the program and values and principles of the Green Party to infect your own community, and making the argument that these values and principles, programs, are valuable to everyone, and that part of what the Green Party is supposed to be about is, in fact, building movement, a movement for real structural change. And that means movements that address the issues of all people in the community who find themselves at the receiving end of injustice, at the receiving end of exploitation and oppression. So part of the process of developing movement is, in fact, making those kind of connections, using one's skills, if you're an artist, to begin to think creatively in terms of how you begin to express the contradictions of the society, but also to advance a idea of what it is we're trying to build. We're not just about exposing all of the problems, which are many, but we need to begin to think about and visualize, imagine what a society would look like when we transgress this, when we transcend this reality. Because this is not the end point, friends. This is not the ultimate expression of what people can create. In fact, this society in many ways is most barbaric. And so we have to envision going beyond this. So this is part of what we need to do, or what you need to do, and to help to do as an artist.
Thanks, Ajamu. I'm reminded of a book I read, an oral history of the Vietnam War that had diverse points of view, and one of the North Vietnamese woman soldiers, long after the fact, said to the interviewer, we were always amazed, the US Army, like we always traveled with our artists, and that was what kept our morale up. And we didn't see any artists with your army. Like, how did you keep your morale up? I always thought that was a very, very telling question. I would like to read, not exactly a question, but a statement, because I would love to introduce this subject to our conversation. Brian Gay wrote, Ajamu speaking about international poverty makes me think of Haiti. I couldn't believe the level of poverty and pollution that exists there, and was shocked to learn that Haiti had to pay reparations to France for the loss of slaves rather than the other way around, as it should be. I'd like to introduce this topic of reparations and hear from our panelists about where are we in the US with reparations? What are our next steps? What should we be doing about reparations?
I don't know who want to go first, but I just want to say we also played slave owners in America for the loss of their slaves here in America. So we're not just talking about Haiti. I think that when we're talking about the creating harm and healing harms, I think that that's where we start when we talk about reparations. Reparation is, the purpose for it is to heal the harm that has been caused to a particular group. And for me, I think that when we look at the status of white supremacy, as our panelists have just pointed out, that definitely African Americans in in this diaspora has been harmed and have been harmed for generations, and definitely there needs to be some mechanism. I don't know what we call it, whether we call it reparations or what we call it, but there has to be some mechanism to try to heal that harm. And so I'm on that standpoint. I think when it comes to Haiti, I think another thing that to point out with Haiti was that they freed themselves too as well. And so they rose up against power and freed themselves. And I think that that is something I'm not advocating that happens here, because I think that in this particular case, what we were talking about freeing ourselves is that making sure that we share equal power. And so when we talk about having diverse perspectives at the table, I think reparations is all fine and dandy, but until you allow diverse groups to sit at the tables of power and decision making, then harms will continue to happen. And so that would be one of the ways I would definitely advocate for, is begin to share power as part of reparations. But I'd like to hear what other people want to say.
Thanks, Joseph. Desiree or Ajamu, would you like to weigh in on reparations?
I would defer to Desiree.
Yeah, so I guess, you know, I kind of wanted to touch, because I feel like Joseph Jackson did a great job talking about reparations. I kind of just wanted to touch on a little bit of what Ajamu had said. You know, there's such a huge focus on othering what's going on in other countries. And so I do respect the question, you know, I'm looking at Haiti and seeing what's going on there. But I do have to say, you know, what's going on here. And there's a lot of disparities going on here and a lot of things that we need to fix here. And, you know, just to repeat what Ajamu had said, you know, historically, you know, there's this Eurocentric and US-centric, I guess, focus. And with white supremacy, it's kind of been considered the default for humanity, society, academia, and healing relationships, and media focus. And so focusing back on the United States and what's going on here, I would say is, you know, something that we need to look at, and we can compare what's going on overseas and internationally. You know, for at least for Maine, for reparations, just, you know, that starts locally. Being able to build relationships with people in leadership positions, and having that representation, you know, shifting that power dynamic, being able to redistribute resources into those communities, you know, first and foremost, truth and reconciliation projects, you know, it needs to be more of less talk and more, you know, support and action. And I would say, you know, like Joseph Jackson said, there are people doing that work. Just support them, redistribute those funds, because there are people who are experts at doing this work, because it's our communities and we've been facing these oppressions. So, you know, reparations start there. It can start with even land sharing. It can start in so many different places. Yeah.
I will come at this question in a slightly different way. For me, the question of reparations is a question that that starts in 1492 with the invasion of the so-called Americas by Europeans. Because that invasion created the material basis for what emerged, not only as the U.S., but also what we refer to as Europe. It was a material basis for the development and the eventual hegemony of the pan-European project. So when we talk about reparations or to repair, for me, the fact that there is continuity in that project, that pan-European white supremacist colonial capitalist patriarchy from 1492 up until today. There could be no reparations until that project has been displaced. I'm not interested in the U.S. colonial state attempting to repair, and I'm not sure how that repair would take place without the power and the resources that were built on my back being returned not only to African people, but also to indigenous people. Basically, we're not talking about real and authentic decolonization in the U.S., then we're not serious about reparations. So for me, it's these elements are interconnected. The reparations question goes beyond just the U.S. It extends throughout the Americas. It even extends to the African continent. That was one of the issues that came up in the Durban Conference in 2001, the Durban Conference Against Racism, where the Bush administration boycotted, and then the Obama administration boycotted 10 years later. This is about, disrupting this continuity of that European project. Anything short of that, to me, is reform. And in fact, it is almost unprincipled collaboration with oppression. You can't repair me. The way we get repaired is when we take power, when we reorganize society, when we create situations for justice for everyone. That's how we disrupt the continuity of that oppressive history. That's when we can collectively repair.
Thank you, panelists. That was a very interesting, diverse perspectives on reparations, and honestly, a little different than conversations that I've been having with people around reparations. So it sounds like we have a much, much bigger project, and I'm very glad that you, all of you, attendees as well, have joined us to have this discussion today. It's really been an interesting one. We have we probably have time for one more question before we wrap up. Let me see. Well, this is a very topical one. How do we stand up to this administration? Oops, my window's jumping. In its colonization of our country with its rollbacks of environmental protections, especially in marginalized communities, and also how can we stop the rollout of the military on our peaceful water and racial justice protectors in Portland, Oregon, and Chicago? It's a big question. I think what we're maybe responding to is seeing the federal government sending Border Patrol and ICE agents, not just in to sweep up people of color, but to actually attack the Black Lives Matter protesters in Portland, Oregon, who have been so consistently out in the streets. I think they're on day 55 at this point, and it seems to be escalating every evening. So I guess the question being, what can we do to support that movement? Desiree, you're making an interesting face, so you must have some thoughts here.
That's a lot to unpack. That's really a lot to unpack. And some of my, my first thoughts are pretty radical, and I'm trying to like unradicalize them in my mind so that I can say them out loud. First things first, I think, the best, I guess that, you can, I think just working within your communities, a lot of people have a huge focus on, fighting the machine, and people forget that part of fighting is also healing and doing the healing work within your community, and doing the protection work in your community and the uplifting work in your community. And it's, fighting against white supremacy isn't always just showing up rallies ready to fight or be arrested or die. And for, you know, Black, brown bodies, it's not, you don't even have to go to a rally to have to, it's not even a choice. You could be walking down the street. I was stopped by Border Patrol today and asked if I was an American citizen, if I had drugs in the car. It could have, you know, that could have went left or right for me. And so that's, I guess for me, you know, really being dedicated and putting your energy and your commitment into your community and building your community is really important. I'm always hanging on a thread between, you know, I'm tired of participating and reinforcing this colonial system. I'm always hanging by a thread. How much more do I want to participate in this before I'm just like, you know what, we need our own communities. And that's just the honest truth. But to me, we are all, you know, we come from all four directions. We're all here together, working together. We're all coming from different identities, and we're here together now. And there's so many people who want to do the work. They're willing to do the work for to heal so much that has gone on. And so I'm really dedicated to, I guess, work on those hopes and the positive side and the togetherness rather than what is tearing us apart. And I guess for now, I'll continue to be able to dedicate both to the community and being able to build up our communities, but also work within our systems to be able to do some reform. Yeah, so that would be my answer.
Thanks, Desiree. Well, this has been a great discussion. I could go on a lot longer, but we are almost out of time. So I am going to thank again Desiree, Joseph, and Ajamu for taking time to be here with us. I could see from the chat people are getting a lot out of this discussion. Please also know that we were live streaming on Facebook and that some of our listeners were sharing the live stream with groups on Facebook. And also, based on our first webinar, many people will watch this webinar after the fact, in other words, not live, as a recorded educational piece for them. So thank you so much for taking your time to be with us and create this great opportunity for us to learn more and be together. And the wisdom of your hearts and the compassion of your intellects is truly inspiring to me. I feel very fortunate to have participated in this discussion with the three of you and our other listeners as well. We do have some webinars coming up in our The Way Forward series, and you will be receiving links to register for those in the email that will contain the recording of this webinar. July 31st, we're going to talk about single-payer universal health care with Dr. Margaret Flowers, who's been working on this topic for years nationally, and she is a past Green Party congressional candidate, and Dr. Bill Clark. He will not be representing Maine All Care, but he works with Maine All Care. And then just today, we heard that we will be having a representative from the harm reduction community also joining us. I'm sorry, I don't know his name right off the top of my head, but we do have a third participant for that one. Should be great. On August 5th, we have a special presentation on how and why to impose the CMP corridor, the so-called New England Clean Connect. We'll be hearing from two members of impacted communities. John Gonzalez is an indigenous person who lives in Rhode Island now, but is from the Cree-speaking people that have been impacted by many of those mega dam projects up in Canada that have been so destructive to the land and the cultures of the people that live on that land. We'll be hearing from Dawn Neptune Adams, who is a Penobscot Nation member and a journalist. And she also is an impacted, part of the impacted community because the proposed corridor would run through indigenous territories here in Maine. And then Jonathan Carter, a past Green Party candidate for governor, who heads up the Forest Ecology Network and has been very active in opposing the CMP corridor. We'll also be at a later date having a ranked choice voting discussion with Chris Kerr, our campaign manager, who worked on both the ranked choice voting campaigns in the past and knows a lot about how that works. Bree Kidman, who was a Democratic progressive candidate in the recent primary, who also knows a lot about ranked choice voting. And then Shane McKibben of Fair Vote, the national organization that promotes ranked choice voting. So I think all three of those are probably worth registering for. And remember, even if you can't tune in at 5 o'clock Eastern time, it's always good to get the link to the recording and be able to learn later on at your convenience. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. I would love to bring in a couple of the people from my team that made this work. Maybe if you want to turn your cameras on now. Kelly Merrill is our Zoom Meister extraordinaire. She's the one that makes all the moving parts move. So thank you, Kelly. We have Chris Kerr, our campaign manager, has been running the chat and feeding questions to me and letting me know which questions had the upvotes. And then Dave Schwab, our communications director, is our live stream master. And that's a tricky part, but it certainly helps us reach a much bigger audience. So thank you, everyone. I'm very, very grateful to your part in today's learning, and be well. And remember, you're not alone. Thanks.